to take a distance from that idea of continuity. So I was looking back at his lecture slides from 2015, and a part of the fact that there was a lot of black slides, which I don't do anymore today. There was also like this kind of really, I think, quite interesting beginnings of an agenda. And the agenda, like briefly summarized, was really based on bringing back the notion of assembly, like on bringing back the notion of parts, and kind of taking a distance from the usual references that were around for the digital, which is the image on the left, the image of continuity, kind of the organic body, Frei Otto, and kind of starting to look back at the notion of parts, which is on the right with Aldo van Eyck. So these slides were like back then presented, like I'm just kind of browsing through the old presentation. So there was this criticism of Greg Lynn, of this kind of the growing body that was not acknowledging parts. And of course, Greg Lynn in one way was also a criticism of a model that we had before, the model of modernist mass production, the model of Le Corbusier's domino. And Greg Lynn was kind of advancing this argument that now that we have robots and all these digital fabrication machines, that there's actually no reason why we should even think about parts at all anymore. Like parts for Greg Lynn don't exist. It's essentially all about segments or parts that are derived from an overarching whole. So in a way, like this kind of, the kind of image that in a way we grew up with thinking that the digital is very much that image that you see here on the screen. Like this is what, if you think about digital architecture, what Google tells you that it is. And that was also the thing that in a way, as an experiment, I think a generation and a lot of people that are here today in this room have started to kill off and have in a way started to look at this work and say that that's actually now not an experiment anymore, that this is actually in a way kind of finished as an experiment, and that's something we take a distance from. And the criticism is not only, in a way, it has run out of steam, like aesthetically, like the moment when we look at these images today, they seem outdated, they seem something from 20 years ago, and they don't seem at all avant-garde anymore. And that's kind of aesthetically, but at the same time also, I think socially, they have been kind of identified as a project that is in many ways not really radical or not really avant-garde. It was a project driven by oil money in Dubai, by kind of lots of, you know, a kind of a 1% economy, right? Which was exposed both intellectually but also socially was exposed after the financial crash in 2008. And this work also back then when I was here at the Prague Biennale, this work was kind of, there was a criticism of this work emerging, that this work is actually in a way a kind of dressing up of the modernist domino, that modernist domino, the kind of essential model is still persistent under the skin of all these buildings, and that it's essentially just kind of dressed up with a story of computation rather than actually, like it's in a way kind of a postmodern project that communicates that computers have been used, but it's not actually a deep investigation. These are some kind of slides from this lecture back then, which was already kind of proposing then to go from continuity to discreteness. And perhaps the project that was kind of most significant for that body of work, which I then presented and was kind of working on, is this project which is called Block Hut. And that's a house for a friend back in Belgium, where I'm from originally. And that house was based completely on the argument that we would actually start off with just one simple part, which is this kind of arrow-shaped element. And the idea with this simple part is that it's in a way kind of looking back at serial production and prefabrication, looking back at a kind of an industry like this, and trying to reread that idea in a digital in a digital way, kind of looking at how we could actually start to combine those elements. And the argument here is that 95%, so everything that is white is the same part, it's repeating, it's not customized at all, and then 5% is customized and needs to kind of, is used to kind of shift and introduce ruptures in the seriality. And the outcome, this is kind of an initial rendering of that project. I think the outcome of that was back then also already kind of promising when we were looking at this, because this was showing that assembly could actually result in something that has absolutely nothing to do with kind of the modernist notion of assembly. Like this building in a way is kind of on the edge between something that is, on the one hand, kind of phenomenologically organic, that looks like a kind of a whole on the one hand, but on the other hand is really assembled and serialized and repeating. So there's a very strange kind of world of assembly and seriality that his work is entering. And of course, what is important here is also this kind of economic argument that in the end, when we're looking at this building, which is perhaps in some instances excessive, that it's in fact kind of a highly economic model where 90% or 95% of those parts are actually repeating. So that's kind of, that was a really kind of important project which was presented here 4 years ago. And then this project did not get built, of course, but then it got kind of also recycled in the practice for a number of other projects like this one in Vienna. And then one thing that I also wanted to pick up from the lecture 4 years ago was actually that idea of manifesto, because that's part of, in a way, the debate today and the larger symposium is this question like, how do we actually write our own manifestos? And the Biennale has actually asked all the participants to write a little manifesto. After analyzing them, I discovered that no one wrote a little manifesto. There are no little manifestos. So again, like I think it's actually very useful to write a little manifesto. And this manifesto that is here is probably one of the most famous manifestos. And it's the manifesto from Dogma 95, which is the founded by Lars von Trier and a bunch of other Danish movie makers, which were so fed up with movies and with the poor quality of mainly American movies that they decided to make some basic rules to be able to increase the quality of movies, right? And what is really intriguing about this manifesto is that it's actually a manifesto that is based on reducing the amount of possibilities, right? It's a manifesto that is based on a kind of austerity, that is based on a reduction of the space of possibilities to prevent basically problems, right? And you can kind of best understand it like this. Like basically, Festen is the first movie done with the Dogma Manifesto. It's an incredible movie where there is no sound, there's no music, there is sound, but there is no music. The camera is handheld. It's kind of very, very reduced, and everything is in a way about the kind of the intellectual game, the story that is happening there. And it's produced obviously on a very low budget. Whereas then the movie on the right is obviously not a Dogma movie. That's a movie that has an unlimited budget. But that unlimited budget and this unlimited space of possibilities is obviously inversely related to the quality or the intellectual quality of the movie, right? So essentially the argument of Dogma, and you can think where in which two movie categories this building would fit then. And basically the argument of Dogma is that you actually, by reducing the space of possibilities, you increase the space for an intellectual conversation. Now the problem is that Dogma, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Dogma has obviously been hijacked by a particular group of architects who are operating under the name Dogma, and who kind of took this similar provocation of reducing the space of possibilities as an intellectual project, which is this drawing on the right. But actually kind of looking back at Dogma, that was also kind of why this manifesto was presented 4 years ago, is actually also the idea that with discreteness and with this notion of seriality, you're also kind of reducing a space of possibilities. And you're actually, rather than creating a kind of an infinite, unlimited, unbridled kind of use of all the technologies that are out there, you're being very precise and kind of creating a limited amount of possible moves, right? So there is this kind of similarity in a way between what was argued then between the kind of the Dogma Manifesto and that work then that was presented as Discrete. And I'm just going to kind of quickly go through a few of these like consequences from the practice. So the practice is, and a lot of the work is essentially based on this creation of these serialized elements. And in a kind of a Dogma way, it's pushed to the kind of ultimate limit that then it's not just one part, but one part also corresponds to one sheet of material and one machine. So it's this kind of, really this attempt to reduce architecture to this kind of absolute, almost, almost ridiculous amount of simplicity, like reducing that space. And these parts, of course, and that's very important, that these parts are not actually in any way kind of modernist parts. They are parts that have no initial meaning, that have no function, but are very much in a way as kind of pixel-like parts that act as a basis for automation and robots to assemble those parts. And that's an approach that not only architects are doing, but also, for example, if you look at NASA, you will see that they're, and at the research of the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT, they're also looking in a way at this kind of systems of assembly to start to create holistic structures. And in a way, also, if you look at the world of automation, there is this kind of similar baseline. And it's very important to distinguish this from this type of work from the modernist precedent, where in a way the part is always also a type, like the part is a room, it's a column, it's a floor slab, it's never a generic type. And that's kind of, for me, the defining difference with modernism is this project, which is obviously discrete, but it's not thought of in a digital way. It supposes one universal human being, which fits in one kind of container, which is then assembled. Or in this project, it's also obviously a project about assembly and discreteness, but again, not thought in a digital way, as it presupposes this kind of hierarchical assembly where every part only performs one specific function. Whereas the parts that we are talking about are always kind of this generic building blocks. And then if you look back at, in a way, this kind of this tension with modernism, it's kind of most, I think, most striking in this image where we compare the Amazon warehouse with this famous image of Ford's factory. And what you actually see is that, unlike what the kind of early generation of the digital was talking about, that actually the contemporary space of digital production is actually, on a certain level, formally not so different from the modernist space of production. Of course, it's entirely different in terms of its organization. Like all the objects that are organized here on those shelves are organized with a logic that is bypassing type and classification, but is about this kind of generic pixel-like logistics. So these two images opposed are kind of really difficult to understand. But what we know is that this space on the right is actually the most kind of significant space for digital production today, the Amazon warehouse, arguably. And it's very different from the way how architects have traditionally thought about the digital. Like, they have thought about it as mass customization, as kind of creating those larger and larger amounts of different segments. And kind of, in a way, like, this is the kind of the vulgar version of this argument, where you can look at the discrete and the continuous as two architectural strategies, where toothpaste, like building with toothpaste, is one, and building with Lego blocks is another one. So you have the kind of the possibility to construct something that has no notion of parts, and then construct something that has a notion of parts. You can construct something that works once, or you can construct something that can keep kind of growing and being reproduced. And of course, this kind of distinction between discreteness and continuity is not a new one. That's something that is so fundamental to architecture that, for example, you could argue that most Western architecture has always been continuous because it's working with stone. Stone is very heavy, and it can only be unified by form, by continuous form. Otherwise, structurally, it just doesn't work. Whereas the notion of discreteness and assembly is always kind of present in timber architecture, where the material properties basically allow you to bypass form. So yeah, and I think I have like 7 minutes left. So I just wanted to also kind of briefly go back to this kind of notion of this 1% versus this 99%. And I think that's also really important in a way for the debate today, is that the generation that is presenting here today is roughly a generation that kind of entered the field in 2008 after the housing crisis, not after the financial crisis, and is kind of confronted with a world that has a series of very clear challenges. One of them, this emerging global housing crisis, or also kind of an emerging crisis of labor, with kind of the pressure that we get from increased automation, and essentially the whole political debate around automation that is starting to become very present. Like, when we're talking about robots, even as architects, it's important to ask the question why we're actually using robots, who owns those robots, and which kind of system are these robots embedded in. And then there is this idea, in a way, and I think also important as a provocation, that in a way our kind of generation should be focused on the 99% of building stock, which means housing, rather than the 1% of spectacular kind of projects. And so you could buy this yesterday, you could buy it. I don't know if you can buy it here today, but this magazine called Discrete contains kind of a selection with a lot of the people that are also here today, presenting both this kind of political argument and a whole new body of work of looking at the digital, right, which is this kind of body. So in my remaining 5 minutes, I'm just going to fast forward. I'm just going to flip through the slides so you know what you missed. And then I'll just kind of talk a little bit about the tactics and politics. So we can finish there. Yeah, so the tactics and politics is just, I think today, like during the symposium, is kind of trying to figure out in a way that if this is an experimental architecture biennale, what this experimental refers to. Because as I've presented before, we know that this work is not experimental anymore. That work was experimental maybe 20 years ago, but it's not today. Today is the baseline. It's what you get taught in schools. It's what is now in big corporate practices. So the question is really today, like, what is this kind of, after this book, for example, by Mario Carpo is written, what is kind of the experiment today, or what are we experimenting with? And I think it's very important to kind of also frame that in this kind of big societal shifts that we're confronted with, as for example, the moment that architecture gets invaded now by the tech industry. So we're seeing, for example, this is WeWork has become London's biggest office occupier. So WeWork is a co-working tech startup from the US, which is basically shuttling artificial money into real estate, and funding has a whole kind of group of architects also working for them, and is starting to kind of invade a space that maybe previously was a space for architects as well. Or Catera, which got 700 million and more from SoftBank and Google to redevelop a kind of a complete production chain from design to construction in the US. But there's also other kind of books which I think are important to kind of sketch a little bit of the context. Like there is this very depressing book by René de Graaf, which is almost a book that is reading a little bit as the end story of architecture, and making a claim that architecture per definition cannot exist today in a neoliberal economy, that it's pure marketing, and that it has per definition no more intellectual content, and that it's just impossible as a project unless we change the economic system. Highly recommended book. There's also the precarity of the architect as worker, and we were encouraged today by the dean to be nice to new incoming students. But I think most of us, when after having finished architecture school, we know that architecture as a profession is a rather precarious job that is not at all as glamorous as it maybe was 30, 40 years ago. And then there is also the kind of within this kind of world of what René de Graaf calls like the intellectual graveyard of architecture. It's also, I think these images are, for me, extremely scary images, are also important, where again, this is kind of forming, maybe as a kind of a manifesto, right? That is, kind of reducing architecture to something very quick, right? And again, this kind of moment that we don't know anymore what is the avant-garde or what is new or experimental. One of these towers is done by a Pritzker Prize-winning practice, but we don't necessarily know which one of these towers that would be. And the other ones are done by Woods Bagot and like a series of really commercial practices, right? And so to wrap it up, kind of my goal today is from this symposium, is to put everyone on a spectrum. We're going to do like a spectrum analysis. So from the presentations, I have like a few questions that we're going to try to put people on a spectrum. And as a kind of an example of this spectrum, this is actually an exercise that was done by Alejandro Zaera Polo, where he mapped a contemporary architecture scene on what he calls this kind of political spectrum. So this runs from like cosmopolitical to austerity-chic to activists, revisionists, skeptics, populists, technocritical. This is kind of maybe the little scene that this biennale situates itself into, is maybe somewhere in technocritical, right? Although some people also maybe are interested in being activists, or some people want to be in the middle of this kind of theme. Some other people are maybe austerity-chic. So the question is really to kind of zoom out a little bit with this spectrum. And there are 3 types of questions which you will be confronted with. So one is a question that is your position on. Then there is a kind of a choice, like the choose one question, and then there will also be a question to define. Like this is kind of, and I will try to land all those questions where they are least welcome, right? So, for example, Jose will get a question about craft and beauty, maybe, and then Daniel will get a question about authorship and maybe populism, and then we kind of like construct a spectrum for there, and everyone will also get the Eisenman or Bjarke question, which is very important to define the spectrum. So I'll leave it there, and then we can continue with you in studio. I think Florian. Yeah, there. Okay.